To add in the final feature of the lightbox, what we want to be able to do is determine if images are portrait or landscape in orientation. Once we know that, then we are going to resize them appropriately to fit in the window. Determining the orientation of the image first is going to be important so that we can resize appropriately, and then after that we will be able to work with it. Now it also will allow us, if we're loading images that are larger than the Windows viewport, this will allow us to call resize image and scale images to fit within that viewport on the first go, so that if the user pulls it up on a smaller screen, they don't have images that don't fit. So that's a good usability approach to work with. Determining if it is portrait, I do eye height is greater than eye width, because that would indicate that our image is portrait in orientation. Conversely, if eye height is less than eye width, our image will be landscape. Third issue that we have is an image that is square. So if height and width are equal, so we can just add that to our first case, and then that's going to take care of that. Now our final option that we could have is, for some reason, we run into that when we're trying to find our height and width and something has gone wrong, so that one of those values or both of those values are not registering correctly, we put in a final else into our if statement here to handle when anything else has gone bad. And then we can just say something went wrong during resize. So it's a good idea to put in a final else, even though you believe you've handled all possible situations, because that protects you in your code, so that will give you feedback if you look in the console when things do break. So that can be a good practice to get into as part of it. As part of resizing this image, what we can do is we will want to set two variables that we're going to then assign values to them as we determine how we want our image to be resized. It allows us just to keep our code a little bit more readable, so that's why I'm going to add those in. Now these are values that need to be able to be changed, because I'm not setting their fixed value right now. So then that's why I used let instead of const on it. The container height, so our viewport height and width, our image height and width, these are all measurable fixed values. That's why we use constant and not let on them. Ratio, we are going to be changing ratio and setting it to have new values momentarily. And then we have our new width that we're working with. Now one thing that I find looks nice when doing this lightbox is to always set it to a percentage of full height. So when we scale the image, if I determine that the container height is, say, 1,000 pixels tall, I want the image then to be 90% of that, or 900 pixels tall, so I'd have a little border around the edge. And that border will scale based on the size of the window. A larger window, we need a little bit bigger border just so it's proportionally, it looks good. It frames in the image, it gives it a little bit of breathing room before it hits the edges. So we're going to work with that. But when we're working with it, and once we figure out the portrait, how to scale a portrait to fit within the window, then scaling a landscape is the same thing. We just have to flip a couple values around as part of it. So if I'm going to scale my image, the first thing I need to do is to figure out what I want my new height to be. And my new height, I want to be 90% of my container height. So I will take my container height and I'll multiply that by 0.9. So that's 90%. So the new height of the image, I'm going to scale it so it becomes exactly 90% of the viewport. So my new width is going to be my original width multiplied by my scale ratio. Now the trick is I have to figure out what is that scale ratio. How do I scale my image? And I have to determine what numbers fit. Now sometimes when you go through this, you can figure it out by just trying to plug in some numbers and figure out what makes sense on your ratios. So to complete the magic here to determine this ratio, the ratio is my container height divided by my image height. And that allows us to figure out what the new height and new width should be for my image. This now gives us our primary resize for portrait images. Then we'll do our primary resize for landscape images, do the CSS transformation, watch the magic happen, say, wow, that's super awesome, that's really cool. And then we'll find that there's some outlying cases that we still have to address with it, but this gets us a lot of the way there as part of it. So moving into the landscape one is going to be very similar with it. So on the landscape one, and we can just, it really is going to be pretty much reversing height and width as we do it. The number one gotcha when you're doing this is that you don't correctly size it out. So our new width is going to be our container width multiplied by 0.9. And then our ratio is going to be equal to our container width divided by our image width. And finally, our new height is going to be equal to our previous height multiplied by the ratio. Now that we have our preliminary reassignment of height and width, we need to set those values, and we set those values by applying them to our image. So we go grab it with jQuery, grab that big image, we'll set it CSS. And as we set the CSS, because we're setting more than one property, we put it inside of curly braces, and then we are able to do key value pairs. So I will set the height will be equal to my new height, put a comma, and then width, colon, new width as part of it. So now that sets our values. This comes as we start running into problems of how it's measuring the height and width based on the size of the container and trying to fit it in. Because sometimes then the new value that it calculates does not fit in our container boundary. So when the image is a portrait image, and we've scaled it, but now if the new generated width is going to be greater than the container's width, again, when we have start getting some weird non-normal screen proportions, then we have to come up with a new ratio where we use the container's width divided by the new width instead of the previous. And then we set our new width based on 90% of the container, and then we update height once more because height has been adjusted, and then we adjust it again here by that ratio. So we take our height and multiply it by whatever that ratio is to scale it down one more time. And then on original landscape images, it's the same problem that if the height doesn't fit within the container after we've scaled, then we have to come up with a new ratio value. And then we update our height and width values accordingly. And when we do that, then as we scale, we can start to get that smoother scale so it doesn't freak out. But now we can see that our caption, as well as the controls, are not properly putting themselves on screen or scaling themselves. And it makes perfect sense why. We changed the height of the image. But under the controls, when they were put up on screen, the controls position information, which helps determine their size in relationship to each other, their position is set equal to the position of the image. But we never update that when we resize the image. So we have to update the position of the controls and update the size and position of the caption. If we do that, then that will reposition those objects on screen. So that's why after resizing the image, down here, we're going to also have to modify the CSS of the caption and the controls. The image resizing itself, the buttons, which are part of the controls, and the caption need to be updated so that they can position themselves accordingly. So we'll tackle one thing at a time. So with that, I can go grab the controls. So we use jQuery controls.css. This time we're only changing one property. I'll be changing my width. So I don't have to use the curly braces, but I'm not doing a key value pair. So notice it's CSS, and then it's just the property inside of quotes, or single quote, comma, and then new width. So this is different than doing two properties like what we did on changing both height and width for the big image. Controls have been resized. They've had their width resized. Now what needs to happen is the caption needs to have its width set and to have its top repositioned so that it will put itself correctly, because right now we can see the width is wrong and it's not anchoring itself to the bottom of the picture. So we need to go do a little bit of CSS love to the caption as well. So I'll go grab the caption using jQuery. We'll just set its CSS property. This time it's a double property that we're using. It's both the top. We'll set its value. I'll fill that in a moment. And then its width. We'll set its value to new width. The width is easy to set. The top requires a little more thinking. We have to take the new height of the existing image, divide it by 2, and then subtract out from that the height of the caption. So we're actually recycling what we did way back at the beginning, where we had to go and grab this information. So previously we grabbed the height of the picture, and then we took out the height of the caption, but then we added back the half the height of the buttons. And that's because of the translate -50% center method that was used to position this in the first place. So now, knowing that, we take half of the new height, and then the rest of this I can now just reuse. So I'll just copy that, because if I don't have to type, I don't want to. So half of the new height minus the height of the caption, add back in half the height of the buttons. And again, that's because this gets pushed down and we're using the translate -50% centering method. That's why we're using these half values as part of this. So I have a redundancy. I'm setting the width of the controls, and I'm setting the width and top of the caption here inside my image load. So I'm using the data from loading that image. But if I look inside of my resize function, I'll see down here, I'm setting the width of my controls and I'm setting the height of my caption. So when I run into the use case where my window is too small and my picture now is too big and it fills the space until I trigger the resize event and now it resizes the image to fit, that tells me that inside my initial click, instead of just resizing my controls right here, I can just call my resize image method. If I save that, and when I commented, I missed that line to comment out. So now it's all properly commented. Save, go here, no error message. I click, and the picture starts out properly resized. Resize my screen. There it is. Load an image. Okay, we got something else happening here. Something else is afoot, or maybe a dog. Tracking down the what is happening on the resizing. So when I click on a picture, I resize the image. Now, when we look at it in some other places, what is happening with this is when we're resizing, we're actually stuck with two values that we don't want, that we just want to clear out and get rid of on it so that we can start fresh. And what we want to do is we want to then get a fresh value for what is the width and height of our image. But we're doing that. What we do is we do a little reset magic. If I can type. So on my big image, I will set the CSS. Now we're going to modify the CSS width and height of our image. So we could do it in 2 lines, or we could do it in a paired value. So I could do width, empty string, height, empty string, like that. So we can set it up like this, or you could do it as width CSS, or big CSS width, empty string, big CSS height, empty string. Both are working. But what we do is we reset so it thinks that these values are empty, so then when it goes to actually measure, it measures from the actual data of the current image. So then it has a correct starting point.